It's my pleasure now to welcome the proposition, Turkey. Opposing on the motion will be the national team Czech Rep. The judges for this round are the chair of the panel, George Yeoman, the chief adjudicator of this tournament. And starting from the left, we have Elena Stefanovic from Belarus, Evelyn Diku from Romania, then we have Norina Mishori from Hungary, my partner in crime, the third person, Alyosha Boshak from Slovenia. Then we have Kelvin Yap from Singapore, Alexander McKellar from Sweden, and we have Spela Župan from Slovenia. And last but not least, Alex Jäger from South Africa.
Okay, the moment has come. I know a lot of you are very excited, and particularly because from the Turkish point of view, this is quite a moment for you. And from the Czech point of view, home team and the national team. Good luck to both teams. Otherwise, let's go. You ready? Let's go.
Before I start, I'd like to thank you all, organizing team and the adjudication team for a wonderful tournament. Mr. Speaker, today we have problems all around the world that are related to huge deficits in countries such as Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, United States, and Iceland. We believe, ladies and gentlemen, these states are failing due to immense deficits and immense government spending, ladies and gentlemen. And on those grounds, ladies and gentlemen, this House would give central banks of all countries the right to limit government spending. Our aim today as team proposition to provide a stable economy that benefits all. We believe, ladies and gentlemen, a stable economy is the way to go. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, the central banks have a significant influence in the economy. They can change most of the factors in the economy. No, thank you, sir. And then, ladies and gentlemen, the central banks are devoid of political populism. And then, ladies and gentlemen, actually, the central banks have a greater economic know-how. They are built with people who have actually economic masters and professors that have excessive knowledge in the banking. And then they're again devoid of political ideology. Go, ma'am.
Who elects the president or the governor of the central bank?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, even though there is a political influence on the central bank, we have seen in many cases where actually central banks have been able to say the political parties, no. This is an example of Greece. Greece bank had said, no, you shouldn't do this before the crisis. We have seen in the idea of Iceland, ladies and gentlemen. Now, on the idea of how we're overspending for political gains, ladies and gentlemen. Politics are inherently populist. Political parties want people to like them. Why? Because, well, ladies and gentlemen, if they do not take popular decisions, they will not be getting the votes of the people, and they will not be elected again. Political parties spend money on policies people like. And we believe, ladies and gentlemen, however spending is not necessarily beneficial is on the long term. Even though it might help us, even though it might stimulate the economy in the short term, even though it might help people and make people happy in the short term, it has long detriments. But parties don't necessarily need to think about detriments, ladies and gentlemen. Why? Parties are looking for short political benefits. Why, ladies and gentlemen? Because the parties are looking for next election. Right now, the effects of the increased spending will come, for example, 10 years later, ladies and gentlemen. This lack of responsibility, lack of fiscal responsibility is a moral hazard, ladies and gentlemen. Why? Because they have no responsibility to people. The detriments will not happen very quickly. And then, ladies and gentlemen, actually, that is why the government is able to arbitrarily spend the money in order to benefit themselves.
Sir.
No, thank you, sir. A spending limit would have actually prevented political parties putting countries in deficits for nothing, ladies and gentlemen. If we enforce a limit on the total spending that is agreed by the central bank, actually we will be able to have the government present us with a budget that is more sensible, that is more conservative. That's why in this idea, we as a proposition side will make you a more responsible government, and ladies and gentlemen, that will be very good. We believe that principally governments cannot spend the money in a way that harms next generations. If we had an independent control on the budget, on the spending, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that actually we'll be able to stop the detriment to the next generation. Principally, we're in the very wrong right now, and the proposition is there to right. And on those grounds, ladies and gentlemen, we're on the proposition.
There is no society without responsibility. There is no democracy without accountability. Why central banks are ultimately wrong? We believe that there are four major issues with this. First of all, that they are independent thus far to a limited degree, partially because they have little power. But adding them power in this way, they will be controlling both monetary and fiscal policy, and therefore there will be much more potential and much more desire to actually affect those policies. So that's the first issue. Second issue, that they're in themselves susceptible to change and influence. The power corrupts, ladies and gentlemen, and we see that even in the United States, there have been problems with, for instance, the previous chair of Fed, the Central Bank of the United States, Alan Greenspan, who has been unable to take into account alternating views, and he has been sticking on to the effective market policy, but I will talk about it a little bit later. The third issue we have is that they are isolated from the struggles of everyday man. They're living in an ivory tower. They went to prestigious schools. They've never really dealt with the people on the ground. They cannot see what the situation is. They are living in their own crystal world. Now, fourthly, there's the problem with, the ideological problems. Frequently, there are no right answers in an economy, and we see that even central bankers disagree on certain issues. We can see that there are problems. For instance, Ben Bernanke, the current chairman of Fed, disagrees over bailouts with the current chairman of European Central Bank. So we see that even within those circles, there's no right answer, and we see that ultimately it leads to the problems of ideological and rigidity. Yes, sir.
We're just giving the control of the banks not to let the governments to overspend. We're not giving them the control to how to spend the money.
Sir, what you're neglecting is that ultimately all this is a decision that has vast consequences in terms of policy making, that has actually impact on the policy making of the real world politics. You're making calls whether or not the state can actually expand its welfare, something that is purely a political decision. There's nothing wrong inherently with big state. It can be small states as well as big states can work just as fine in case if they have balanced budget. But what you're effectively doing is you're making a political call. Now let me move to the second level of political gains. What we see is that first of all, people, if they decide this, they have ultimately the right to do so. I'll talk about it a little bit more in my case. But secondly, we see that politicians still have the motivation to do so. We see that, for instance, Margaret Thatcher has been a very austere politician, and even in the case where this is nothing like that has happened. And we see that there is going to be a change of paradigm because of what people now begin to see as a problem. Previously, spending has never been such a big issue, but with Greece, we see that there are other problems that are coming with budget deficits, and ultimately people's mentality will change in itself. And this is why the people all across the globe are now calling for austerity, because they see that there are problems with that. Let me move to the power of no control. What they're saying is that there is no representation, no moral hazard, and that this is why they are better. But ultimately, this is why they're not accountable to the people. They're there distantly, unelected by the people, and they're making calls that are going to affect everyone. This is ultimately wrong because we're trying to live in a democracy, and this is effectively preventing it. Fourthly, the government cannot spend future money point. We see that ultimately the same point applies here. They are not accountable to the people that have elected them. They are there just because government has decided so. And lastly, in terms of separation of power, we are seeing that they have been proposing something similar with separation of power, but ultimately they're concentrating fiscal and monetary policy into the same level. So this is by no means good for the government because they will have much more power in the future. Now let me move on to my counter proposal. What we present is that there is the same problem. However, we see that the cause is is to the contrary. We see that democratic referenda to approve deficit budgets, that is only budgets that actually require spending, will have to be held. So the people and the politicians will have to provide information for those people. If they want to make a budget deficit, they will have to win the public support in order to have that. Otherwise, if this referendum fails, they will have to go with previous budget or balanced budget, both of which actually foster austerity. And we see that these referenda will not be held every year because politicians will have no motivation to do so. Now let me move to my level of responsibility and how we're actually solving their problem in a better way by adding more democracy. Currently, there is a lack of democracy's responsibility in those areas. Central bankers are distant from the people, they're unelected, they are not controlled by the people. And we see that this is wrong because the spending that they will ultimately control is not, as relevant to them as it could. If we, however, enact our proposal, the spending that we'll make will be justified because the people will know that they're spending money, they will be aware what this is ultimately causing, and they will have to partake in this policy-making process, ultimately making it much more close to the desires of the people. And no one wants to live in a state that is dealing with, budgetary crisis. So we see that the spending will be much more justified in those levels. Secondly, let me talk about the politicians themselves will be more responsible because they will not seek budget deficits in the first place. They will not want to go through the strenuous process of justifying their proposals. They will not want to actually have to be forced to go around the public and explain why is it so necessary, why is it so important. Will not have to waste so much of their time that they can even spend on policy making just because they will have to justify their budgetary crisis unless it's really necessary. So we see that again, the spending will be less and will be more justified under our proposal. And lastly, let me talk about how people themselves will become more responsible. First of all, people react in a way that giving them more responsibility will make them behave more responsibly. So the people themselves will look forward to decisions and they will think about it because they will know that they are part of the decision-making process, unlike under their proposal. But let me also talk about how they will think about this more, because they will now be presented with a check, and they could either send a name to the unbalanced budget or not. They will be forced to think about twice whether or not they actually require the welfare system that will actually make them pay twice as much in the future than they would receive now. They will think about twice whether what the government's proposing is really necessary, and they will think about whether or not this is essential. So what we see is that the plans that we have presented on both sides of the day ultimately achieve the same outcome. But even if they do not, and my second speaker will elaborate on this a little bit more, our solution is better just because of the democratic deficiency that they have. Our model is ultimately responsible to the people, to the ones that are paying the bills, to the ones that are ultimately paying the taxes, paying the budgetary crisis. So we see that our level is more legitimate and has right to make the call, and even if they have the right to do so. So for all these reasons, I beg you to make our system more democratic, nor not less.
Ladies and gentlemen, today, the side opposition proposes a model that democratic system will solve everything. When you have referendums, that means populist policies will continue, ladies and gentlemen. People will still want their minimum wage increased. They won't say, oh, budget should be very less so that my minimum wage will be low, ladies and gentlemen. The parties will still use that, ladies and gentlemen. When there's a referendum, you don't throw parties out of the system. And populist policies will continue. Actually, they will increase, ladies and gentlemen, because you are giving them the right to choose that budget. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, how can you say that the people can understand the economics in the long term rather than these people that are actually graduating these schools, that are actually economists, that actually can see what budget increase will lead, what if you overspend will lead to, ladies and gentlemen. So we say that these are professionals, ladies and gentlemen. They know these things better than the people. If actually people knew these things better than these people, ladies and gentlemen, they would have thrown the governments away that overspent, ladies and gentlemen. But we see that in the electoral system, they didn't do that. They voted for the parties that did these populist policies. Yes.
But you're still neglecting the point that people are ultimately the ones who are paying the bills.
The thing is, ladies and gentlemen, that when it comes to that, they are not the people that vote in the elections. They are the people that get affected, ladies and gentlemen. As my speaker points out, are the future generations, ladies and gentlemen. We say that your fathers do not have to make you live in debt, leave you in debt, ladies and gentlemen. The thing is that democracy works when you only get affected by this, ladies and gentlemen. But the thing is that today Greece suffers not because the Greek people of today's generation did the wrong thing. They suffer because of, no thank you, they suffer because the last generation did the wrong thing, ladies and gentlemen. And we've shown you that how this is not okay, ladies and gentlemen, how democracy is not working here. So ladies and actually, again, their referendum proposal will give you our more proposals, because that means that, ladies and gentlemen, we have elections every year, ladies and gentlemen, that because the budgets are made each year. So in their case, ladies and gentlemen, you have the budget taking an entire year to debate, to elect, and that stuff. So you are not making any long-term economic policies in the meanwhile. So the referendum system, ladies and gentlemen, doesn't change anything, and actually doesn't change anything in the sense of more accountability, but makes the situation worse. When you talked about austerity package, no thank you, when you actually accepted our proposal, you neglected the fact that right now most of the people in Greece are against these austerity measures, ladies and gentlemen. So there is no tax cut. But all the economists in the world actually agree on the fact that there should be an austerity package in the Greece. There is a right in the economy, ladies and gentlemen. It's not like they say. There is a black and white in the economy, ladies and gentlemen. But how there's a black and white, our first speaker proven you. Budget deficits are always wrong, ladies and gentlemen. Making your country in debt are always wrong. We have shown you this. No, thank you. And you have to prove us, if there's no right and wrong that making debt can actually be good, and say that economists actually agree on this, ladies and gentlemen. And then they talked about a little bit about how we are giving too much power to these central banks. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, judges have no accountability at all, ladies and gentlemen, but we still trust them, we still have them. But these people actually have accountability to a few things, ladies and gentlemen. They have it to smaller banks, they have it to the industry, ladies and gentlemen, so they have some responsibility. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, you have to show me how they will abuse this power, because we see that they have no reason to abuse this power, ladies and gentlemen, and we have seen that they never actually failed us in their policies of raising interests and controlling other things, ladies and gentlemen, so they work really well. So they do not abuse their power, so the fact that they're not accountable is not very problematic. So now let me come to my argument, ladies and gentlemen. Unity in economics, in the monetary policy, ladies and gentlemen. Now, think of a business, ladies and gentlemen, that has two heads that will work independently from each other, ladies and gentlemen. One manages some area of business and the other does the other things, ladies and gentlemen, but they have no coherence. They do not work together, they do different things. We think that that business will not survive, will take that instead, will not survive for a long time. And that situation that right now, ladies and gentlemen, in this world is just like that. But I will tell this after I take this point, yeah.
How can you at the same time advocate separation of power and yet say the unity in economic policy?
The thing is, ladies and gentlemen, that we say separation of power in the sense that governments should not get the right of free spending, ladies and gentlemen. They get the right to how to spend the money. They shouldn't get the right to spend as much as they can, ladies and gentlemen. But we say in that case, ladies and gentlemen, but when you talk about monetary policy, ladies and gentlemen, you need a unity in power. But we say that when it comes to separating the fiscal policy from the monetary policy, there is a separation of power. You have to know that. Fiscal policy is about how we spend it. I'm talking about monetary policy right now, ladies and gentlemen. So, currently in our economy, ladies and gentlemen, government can money print, ladies and gentlemen. So the government can do a monetary policy. They can make our printing, they can increase the budget. And in the meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, central banks can raise interest rates, they can partially control currency exchange and do the inflation rate as well, ladies and gentlemen, no thank you. So we see that there are two issues that go to monetary but are in separate hands. What happens then, ladies and gentlemen, is that government prints money, ladies and gentlemen, because it says that, well, if I print money, I will have more money to spend, so I will do that, ladies and gentlemen. But what happens in the end is that the central banks actually don't want to raise their interest rates, but they are forced to do so in the meanwhile. But the thing there is, ladies and gentlemen, that the central banks have their long-term policies for the benefit of the economy, ladies and gentlemen, but the government gets to actually infringe upon them. And when government does that, the central bank doesn't change interest rate as the government wants because they have tried to preserve some of their policy too. So in the end, ladies and gentlemen, we have two separate policies that clash with each other, and in the end, we don't get a single unified policy that works for the good of all. So when you give that right to the central bank, you can no longer print money and you are actually in a better situation. Then actually increasing international credibility, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, it's important in two issues, ladies and gentlemen. It's about an investment, ladies and gentlemen. Investment ensures growth in the long term. But in today's world, ladies and gentlemen, the thing is that the governments do deficit, ladies and gentlemen, and governments overspend. Investments say, when you say overspend, you have a high risk of default, so I'm not investing in you. But the government takes this risk, ignores more investment because of the fact that the investment doesn't happen in a day like that. It takes 5 to 10 years for investment to actually realize and contribute. But government says, well, the election is next year, so I would prefer to raise the minimum wage now. So in that case, you decrease the investment and you decrease more growth in the future. The second is credit ratings. The thing is that you need to borrow when there's an emergency, as my first speaker told you, ladies and gentlemen. But the thing is that when you are not controlled, there's the problem of credit going out, ladies and gentlemen. And what that happens is that, ladies and gentlemen, you have a deficit. Now, when you have a deficit, ladies and gentlemen, credit rating go down. You cannot borrow, ladies and gentlemen. And when you have a crisis like happened in Japan, you don't have the money to spend. And that means, ladies and gentlemen, the government actually is in a very troubled situation. So we need that credit rating to stay high. For all these cases, ladies and gentlemen, we are inside of
For all that the proposition has learned about crises, they are still advocating a top-down approach to our problems, which are caused by a lack of responsibility of the people, as their first speaker conceded. First, let me point out to you that we have correctly identified a problem. We have identified this lack of responsibility that actually leads to deficits which are unjudicious. We say that we are going to the root. We're not offering a quick fix which may not even work, as we've shown with the central banks. And let me point out to you that they've never responded to you why central banks are really the good agents to do anything. Then we've heard the attacks that, well, referendum will just keep the populism going because people will always approve a deficit budget. No, thank you, sir. But this we already explained. We pointed out to you that this referendum is an additional check to ensure responsibility. Because when a referendum says, will you approve this budget even though you will have to pay 100,000 euros in your future life? No, thank you. This means that the people see the benefits in the short term just as well as the long-term harms. And we say that this is absent in today's system. With regards to the challenges that we've heard, that populism will be still going on, this is the answer. But we've also heard that people do not have the knowledge because they are not the economists. To which we point out that firstly, economics is the most important thing in life of those people. They work, that is economics. They are going into education, that is economics. They need research, that is economics. They need their jobs safe, that is economics. Yes, sir.
Do you believe that people can understand such a technical issue as a budget making, which in every industry actually an expert does?
I'm sorry, if we want to give all the decision making to some wise guys in the Fed, that's not democracy. We think that people understand very well what they need, and they don't need to understand the technicality of the budget to see the long-term harms. That they need to pay something more because they ultimately foot the bill. Furthermore, we see that they've never dealt with this idea that economists don't have the right answers. So it's wrong to delegate these ideas to economists simply because they are also ideological. There are Keynesian economists, there are monetarist economists. So who do we run into? There's no right answer and they have to respond to that. So let me move on to my other idea, the democracy and responsibility. And I will be talking about which fosters which. But first let me point out the importance of this. Our society stands on democracy. And our society stands on the citizens that actually have a say in the public forum. Without citizens who are responsible and who go on into democracy, we are devolving into a plutocracy, into someone ruling us without our knowledge of what is good for us, which means that they will neglect what we need. This is something that they've also never dealt with, that these economists live in their ivory towers, no thank you. They are not the everyman on the street. They have their elite education. They've never met anyone who has taken out their prime mortgage. No thank you, sir. Furthermore, what we see is this idea of accountability. And we pointed out to you that if someone else calls the shots for now and for the future in the central bank, that is not democratic. That is just ill-advised. On the other hand, what we see when we, and I'll take you in a moment, when we give the people the call, they have direct accountability for what happens. They see if we now vote to continue our education spending and to continue our stimulus spending, then we'll have to repay that in the future. Why not, sir?
Sir, the proposition has told you that people vote for actually irresponsible policies because they're not going to be paying for them, the future generation, that was the principle and that would grow.
Sir, communities make tough calls today and ever. They vote whether they will go to war, even though it will affect the future generations. They vote whether they will invest in education, although that will most clearly affect the future generations. But this all requires spending. We say that these communities are right to do so and that this is a necessary thing in our life. We don't see how that will not happen with the central banks, because central bankers will need to make those exact same calls without that accountability. No, thank you. Furthermore, we see that they will have to make value judgment without popular support. They will need to limit spending all the time, which means that expenditure in a policy will not be possible. Which leads me directly to my substantive idea that people have a right to make a wrong decision. Because we see, firstly, that it's a value judgment. There are problems in economies which have no right answer. Krugman and Strauss-Kahn disagree on EU bailouts. Warren Buffett and George Soros disagree on the euro and the feasibility of Greece. We see that if the economists disagree, it is very legitimate to give the people the right to decide on the principal course of action. Otherwise, it's undemocratic and we lose what our society is built upon. Furthermore, we see that the people have this right because they carry the consequences. If the policy has a short-term or long-term harms, people still have to pay for it. No, thank you, sir. So they should decide about it, not some guy at the Fed. We see that if people write the check and foot the bill, then they should be the ones to order the dish. And it is wrong and immoral to impose someone else's screw-ups on them, especially if it's a central banker who is not democratically elected. Now, having dealt with the principles of society, let me move on to stakeholders' incentives. We pointed out to you that voters, if they do not see the long-term harms, if they see long-term harms, they don't want them. So this is something that goes contrary to the deficit spending. Now, we've also seen that now they are unwilling to accept debts. There is no responsibility. And this is what I'm going to talk about more. Because we see that they need to have the responsibility to actually accept austerity measures. Then we see that central banks still have no accountability. We heard that they have accountability to banks and businesses. We think this is a joke. They have their own discretion. They don't need to say why they did something to anyone. And furthermore, we've been prompted to say where they abused this. And we've pointed out to you the example of Alan Greenspan, who continued to push his bias even despite everything. And we see that politicians have no incentive to do this and they never dealt with this. So finally, what is this financial outcome? We've heard that deficits are always wrong, but we've already pointed out to you that stimulus and education and research and bailout are legitimate choices. Then we've heard that we need international credibility. But we need to point out to you that in order to have international credibility, people need to be flexible. And this is my constructive matter, that they need to be able to accept the austerity measures, but right now they're not accepting them because they don't see that as their own responsibility. We see that people in Greece are revolted because they think that it is somebody else's debt. But this decreases their credibility on the international affairs even more. We see that Prof doesn't solve this. They exacerbate it by moving this problem on to some central banker. And finally, about this idea of a unified policy, we say that this goes directly against the separation of powers. This is undemocratic. If we give someone else the complete power to direct where the money is spent, how much it's spent, that is something that means that the community is a vassal to this person. So what have I done in my speech? I pointed out to you why it is important to have accountability and democracy in our society and why it is wrong to take it away, even despite wrong decisions. I pointed out to you the fundamental shift in incentives. And finally, I have shown to you that financial outcome is good. Thank you for your attention.
from my standpoint, I saw two clash points in this debate, and I will address firstly the idea of the effectiveness and the independence of central banks and how they will work. And then I will take a look at their model and see if it really enforces democracy, see if we really need to enforce democracy this far, and like see if they really enforce responsibility in such a system. We said that the central banks were an effective solution to our problem because they had the know-how, they were fairly independent, and they had the power to set a monetary policy, not fiscal policy, mind you. That was this manipulation by side opposition. The central banks are going to set monetary policy with the only criteria that there be no budget deficits, ladies and gentlemen. Team opposition should have told you why, when you give that power to the central banks, why you also give them the power to like say where the money goes. Now they contended the power of the effectiveness of central banks under 3 points. 1, influence, how they will be influenced by the state. 2, how much power they have. And 3, how they have no knowledge of the man on the street. Now, the first point, that they have government influence on them. Well, firstly, what do we know about central banks, ladies and gentlemen? Once you appoint a manager to a central bank by the state, ladies and gentlemen, and yes, they are right. The state appoints a manager to a central bank. But once you do that, ladies and gentlemen, you can't get that. You can't change the position of that guy. And the central bank is actually formed very much like a private structure. And I'll take you in a second, man. It's formed very much like a private structure with a board of shareholders where it functions independently from the state. Go ahead, man.
You cannot get rid of the person, therefore he has no incentives to be accountable and responsible to the people.
He does have incentives to be accountable and responsible, and to make the central bank work well. Because what I've told you like 3 seconds ago was that the central bank has an independent board of shareholders. And I've told you that it's pretty much run like a private company, where if the central bank is not doing its job, that guy is going to be very accountable because of the power of the other shareholders. Now, moving on to the second idea of power corrupts. Well, firstly, ladies and gentlemen, as I've told you before, team opposition have never explained why we're going to give them the ability to modify fiscal policy as well as monetary policy. We need explanation in their next speech. Sir. And then I've already told you about the accountability to shareholders, so that point falls. Now, the third thing they brought was that the central banks, because they were all bigwigs, so it went to like fancy schmancy, like universities, like big schools or something, they had no knowledge of the man on the street. Well, surprise, surprise, ladies and gentlemen, there's a lesson for that in those big fancy schools. It's called Sociology 101. The behavior of the common man on the street is actually quite easy to map out, and those bigwig schools do it every day, all day, ladies and gentlemen. Tell us why these guys are not going to know about the needs of a man on the street. Now, thank you, sir. Going on to their model, ladies and gentlemen. In their model, they defended basically, they firstly defended this idea of ensuring more democracy that I wish to refute first. Now, what they said was if you give these people like monetary policy by referenda, this is going to be more democratic than leaving it in the hands of basically a committee. Well, ladies and gentlemen, why don't we abolish high courts? And why don't we let the public judge with like citizen referenda every time someone's tried at court, ladies and gentlemen? Why is team opposition very strictly opposed to the viewpoints of central banks and not to the viewpoints of other government committees? And
Sir.
You seem pretty impatient, sir.
Yes, I am, because the high courts fulfill the will of the people for a law, whereas central banks impose policy on everyone against their will.
Central banks also enforce the benefit of the people. Central banks enforce that the people don't crash and burn in the event of of economic hardship, ladies and gentlemen. Central banks enforce the right of the people to live in a stable economy, to not face the situation that Greece is facing, where those guys go into crises every every 2 years or something. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that's inherently wrong. We think that the central banks are actually enforcing a very important aspect of a person's life, ladies and gentlemen. And second thing in their model that I wish to look at is their complete agreement on what the problem was. Team Proposition brought to you that we have issues where people's populist votes affect long-term economic stability in the country. They completely agreed to that, and even they said that that we need more austerity measures, which is exactly what my second speaker has talked about, which is exactly what my second speaker has told you about what the central banks would actually help to put in place, what the central banks are going to do more effectively than any referendum, ladies and gentlemen. And ladies and gentlemen, they proposed is the word of John Q. Public, ladies and gentlemen, who was supposedly going to think about everything for himself instead of that committee. Well, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, we know that John Q. Public doesn't know everything about economics. He hasn't went to that fancy bigwig school, ladies and gentlemen.
Sir.
John Q. Public doesn't always think everything through. John Q. Public has a great tendency to look at the most immediate, the most lucrative and close by outcome of any kind of choice the government gives it, ladies and gentlemen. We think that John Q. Public cannot be trusted on this. They said that John Q. Public is going to be independent if we give him the ability to go to referendum than him being voting for the state and the state making all monetary policy. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the problem we have today is because of an increased reliance on the word of the people on the street, ladies and gentlemen. Increasing the power of the word of the person on the street is going to make these people who are easily swayed by propaganda, who see the closest and most lucrative options, go for the easy choices, leaving the economy in shambles, ladies and gentlemen. They went on to say about this is that they're going to be responsible because they're going to be paying the bills. One, ladies and gentlemen, that the fact that they're paying the bills does not mean that they're going to be very far-sighted about this issue. As I told you, they're easily swayed by propaganda. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, what both of my speakers have told you is that they're not all the people they're paying the bills. They actually make people 30 years later pay the bills for them, and we think that is inherently wrong. And that brings me to the final argument that I wish to make, which is my closing statement, ladies and gentlemen. What has Team Proposition given to you today? We have given you long-term stability. We have given you, on principle, the inassailability of the rights of the majority, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why we stand on side.
Will suffer. Very emotional statement and very emotional proposition that is actually not solving the problem. Firstly, let's talk about central banks, and there are 7 problems I have identified with giving the responsibility to central banks. Now, first of all, we have told you that in economics there is no right answer, there is no correct answer. Therefore, the proposition is illogical to say that people will always make wrong decisions because they haven't studied properly economics. Now, we said that even the experts cannot agree on what is the right course at the same time. However, what we believe is the most important point is that people are accountable and responsible for these decisions, and then they can have the consequences they voted for. Second problem we have with the central banks is that bankers are really distant, and therefore they do not know what people really need in that country. And we're told, well, they have studied sociology one-on-one. Now we have told you that sociology actually is studying people like bugs. That is not understanding what the masses of people need. And that is what we see as the fundamental problem if you're living in the ivory tower and do not know what's going on. The third problem we've told you is that power corrupts, and these people are unaccountable because they are appointed by the government, for example, and then there's no way how to get rid of these people, for example. We have told you that centralization of power is undemocratic fundamentally, hardly any response on their side. We have told you that the central banks should not be making political decisions because actually if you're limiting budget deficit, then you're limiting government in its discretion on what it can do, because you then force the government to prioritize the issues. And we say that this is not the role of the central bank. In addition to that, we said that the sixth problem is that the political influence means that the banks cannot be really as independent as the proposition is talking about. Again, hardly any response. The seventh and last problem we have identified is the false logic on proposition side when they're telling us, well, the central bankers never failed us, and therefore they will not fail us in the future. But we say that this is clearly a non sequitur, because just because something has not happened in the past, which we do not really see, that central bank has never failed. Because there were many cases, for example, in Turkey, when central banks were doing the wrong decisions. And therefore we say that just because something has not happened, then it cannot happen in the future. By contrast, we say that democratic referenda are much more important in this debate. We are told that people are irresponsible. We've told you that this is not the case. Firstly, that you cannot judge if the decision is good or bad. Secondly, we've told you that there are incentives for the people to be informed and to make responsible decisions. We've told you that people are able and have the right to make these decisions. Hardly any response. We have told that referenda still mean populism, and we have told you that there are no incentives for politicians to hold these referenda in the first place. Again, hardly any response on the proposition side. We have told you that these referenda will not take place each and every year, but rather, if there is a need for budget deficit, and if there's a deficit running, then it has to be a referenda. But we've told you that there are incentives for politicians not to have deficit in the first place. So that is for the comparison of proposals. Now moving on finally to the principles. Yes, sir.
Our parties are accountable to us, but they still ran our economy bankrupt. Why they will that more accountable changes?
Sir, your problem with your proposal is that you are giving the power to the people who are not accountable to anyone, except for the one who appointed them. And we said that this is fundamentally undemocratic. Firstly, about the principle, you're told that the next generation will be harmed. Now, first of all, in that case, we're saying that the people who are not elected should not be deciding about the future generations. Secondly, we say that the only person who can decide about the future generation is the parents. Thirdly, we say that even in 30 years, the people who are voting for these are more likely to be still there, because on average, you live to the age of 80 or 79. So we say that this is, again, not a problem. Secondly, we were told the separation of powers is brilliant. In that case, we do not see a reason not to separate fiscal and monetary policy. And we have told you how this is dangerous and leads to more political decisions made by the central bank, which is not its role. And thirdly, we have told you that people have the right to make decisions. That people have the right even to make so-called wrong decisions, as the proposition would like you to believe. And we also believe that if you're not allowed to make these bad decisions, then you also don't have any freedom at all. Because we say that people should be free to choose who, and then, who is obviously the people, but how are they going to be blamed? Yes, sir.
You have the right to choose what will affect you. But the thing is that in this case, it doesn't affect you, it just affects 30 years later, so you have no responsibility in this.
Sir, it affects you in this very person 30 years later. It affects your children, and you're taking other measures to take care of your children. You decide for your children, and therefore we do not see a reason why you should not be deciding for your children in this policy as well. So that is for the principles, ladies and gentlemen. And now moving on finally to the impacts. Now, first of all, we have told you that people are inherently being more responsible. If you have a proposal that tells you that you can get $5,000 for this measure if you approve it. However, in that case, it means that the state will get indebted, and each and every person in that state will be in debt, for example, by 30,000. Then the people will think twice if this measure is good, if this deficit is really necessary. Hardly any response on proposition side. We'll tell you that people are more likely to be making logical decisions, because that is really something that affects them in everyday life. It is so important that these people will not just go to the elections and pick randomly. The people who go to the elections are most likely to be thinking about it twice. This is called the process of self-selection, ladies and gentlemen. That the people who go to the elections actually care and can make good decisions. And even if these decisions were not so good in the long term, we say that still there's a right for the people to do that, because they are the ones footing the bill. No response. And thirdly, we have told you, thank you, that what is really important is that these people accept austerity measures. Because if the people don't accept austerity measures and revolt against the government, it only makes matters worse, because then, on the international field, the country is not seen as a credible borrower. And that is what we see as a fundamental harm. Because if these people voted for the proposal that made the country borrow more, then they are the ones to blame. They're the ones responsible, and therefore they're much more likely to bite the bullet and go with the flow and with the austerity measures. So we say that this is the really important thing we have to realize, that if we want really as a proposition the people to accept austerity measures, then they have to vote for not being so austere at the first place. So in my speech I've shown you, first of all, that central banks are not the right actors to be given power to for many reasons. The democratic referenda uphold the values we need the most, being separation of powers or the right to make decisions. And lastly, that the impact on voters and decision making as a whole is overall beneficial. With that, I rest my case.
Ladies and gentlemen, the proposition's Keynesian models are tidy and neat, but we say that their top-down approach is a fatal conceit. What is important in this debate? We think that the proposition have two burdens of proof. Firstly, to show that their proposal will not violate the essential societal principles. Because if we compromise those, then no matter the practical outcome, we should not implement such policy, because our society and perpetuating this society is something that really matters to us. Secondly, what we say is their burden of proof is to show that their practical outcome is so much better than ours, and that it actually will work even despite all those drawbacks. And we say that avoiding deficits is not enough. We say that decisions for the people are the standard. Now let me move on to principles. We've pointed out to you that there are two levels on which this policy, their policy violates the principles of democracy and accountability, under which our doesn't. We've pointed out to you that it is moral to have democracy as a people's right, and it is not moral to give the central bank a universal, unified power to call the shots on both monetary and fiscal policy, which you do if you limit the spending so that people must prioritize whether they want the stimulus or money for education. No response. We've told you that it is moral, that people deserve the right to call the shots if they foot the bill, now or 30 years later. Because ultimately, it is not moral for someone else to push them to pay for something that they did not decide for. And no response to that. But we see that this principle of accountability is important, very important. Thirdly, we see that people should have the right to choose the value course that they find more appealing. That if there are Thatcherites, it should be austerity. If they voted for Obama, it should be the stimulus. But central banks should not call the shots without consulting the people, simply because they are too divided on that. We've given you the example of the Fed and the ECB being quite contradicting one another on bailouts. No response to that. We say that central bankers impose their calls now. We see Alan Greenspan imposing his bias on the United States for the last 20 years. And we say that it's not democratic, it's not right. And this is where they lose the debate. But furthermore, what we say is that they also lose it on accountability. We say that, we've pointed out to you that central bankers are not democratic, that they are not accountable to voters. Their shareholders are fellow economists who have the same bias. Whereas voters in our proposal are accountable to themselves. And we see that this accountability is a primary prerequisite for a functioning society. Now, secondly, about functionality, we say that we've pointed out to you that we want both on direction and management. We say that benefiting people is the primary prerogative. And they've only said that avoiding deficits is something that we should do. But we've pointed out to you that firstly, it's not true. We should be free to run a deficit if we need both education spending and a stimulus spending and the bailout. But furthermore, we say that it's also not important as long as the people accept it. We've pointed out to you that people decide about what they need, whether it's bailout or spending on education, and ultimately they benefit under our proposal, and they have the responsibility that they need to. Plus, they have the less propensity to unreasonable deficit, and they have much more propensity to deal with cases of unreasonable deficit, as in Greece. We've pointed out to you that in Greece, the problem is that people do not accept their responsibility for those deficits that the central bankers and the government have created, even though they voted for those parties, and that is what lowers the international credibility, and no response to that. So fundamentally, ladies and gentlemen, they are trying to sell us a free lunch. But we see that on morality and on principles and on functionality, we must win this debate.
Mr. Speaker, today we had an opposition which accepted the proposition's analysis of the problem. The proposition told you that because we have political parties saying to people that you will get a lot more in the short term, you should vote for us, and they'll be giving them preposterous things such as high wages, and people accept this. And opposition accept this analysis. What they have brought you is more power to people, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we have proven you on side propositions that why we can take power from people, how we're principally obligated to take power from people if the next generations are going to be hurt and if they themselves are going to hurt. We've shown you how people are not responsible, how central banks are more responsible, and on those grounds, ladies and gentlemen, this debate is more to the side of proposition. So, ladies and gentlemen, aside the analysis that the opposition's case was that giving more power to people while they have voted for policies that harm them in the long term, harm the others, let's go to the idea of principle analysis. We've told you on side proposition why it is principally important that even if 100% of the populace say that we're going to have, for example, deficits for example, higher wages, such an easy decision, even if it is so, ladies and gentlemen, because of the fact that in long term, the next generation will be paying for that, we've told you that it is principally wrong. We've given you examples of high courts stopping laws that harm future generations on the grounds that, you know what, you cannot harm people who are not active in your decision to self-harm, ladies and gentlemen. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we've told you how the principle of the state says that you will be able to take control from people if they're harming themselves and the other people, ladies and gentlemen. We've shown how in the idea of high courts, we're actually able to take their right to decide on judicial matters. Why, ladies and gentlemen? Because we've told you that they cannot decide very correctly. We told, ladies and gentlemen, how people cannot be given the power, ladies and gentlemen, because frankly, they cannot be responsible. Because, ladies and gentlemen, even the high-level politicians don't fully understand and convey the concepts of economy. But the fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the people who will be working for them will not do anything, will be looking for their short-term benefits, nothing else, and more important, ladies and gentlemen, you know what? Actually, they will not be responsible as the opposition search. Why, ladies and gentlemen? Because the detriments of such policies do not come very easy, ladies and gentlemen. Because the whole analysis as a responsibility and how people will be actually stopping irresponsible spending is actually failed, ladies and gentlemen. Why? Because if I'm not going to actually be hurting from that, usually majority will be voting for that proposition, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we believe the opposition's case preposterous. Then they had this last-minute burst of principally right and practically right. We've shown you how principally, actually, we have the right to take the democratic power. We have shown you how principally we're on the right to take power from people. Why? Because we're helping themselves and we're helping the next generation and we're stopping harm, ladies and gentlemen. Then here's the actual idea of how deciding, ladies and gentlemen, how banks decide. We've shown you how there is a right or wrong. You don't spend too much if you don't have money, ladies and gentlemen. On those grounds, ladies and gentlemen, it is not like an idea of how to allocate your money. It is a very simple decision. Are you going to spend with your budget, ladies and gentlemen? The opposition asserted that this is a very complex decision. But ladies and gentlemen, the fact of the matter is you decide whether to spend money when you don't have it, ladies and gentlemen. On those grounds, there is a right, there is a wrong. Then on the idea of accountability, we've shown you how banks have more know-how, how judges, how they're like judges and we can trust them, how we actually do trust people to have full authority. We told you how their job is this and how they're responsible to the ideas of society. So they had actually, the team opposition on the other hand, failed to respond to some of our points, ladies and gentlemen. They actually didn't respond fully to the limitless power of the problematic thing, ladies and gentlemen. The political parties still actually make populist things, and they actually help people spend more, and they didn't respond to the idea of how limitless power is bad, and they didn't respond to the idea of how principally we're on all those grounds, ladies and gentlemen, we're on the opposition. Thank you very much.